Coppola blew 27 million recreating Las Vegas only to earn 600 grand, bankrupt his studio, and still had the nerve to try it again 40 years later. Michael Cimino burned through 220 hours of footage and $44 million to make Hollywood's most hated Western. And John Travolta called his Scientology disaster the Schindler's List of sci-fi, right before it sank a studio into fraud, court battles, and bankruptcy. These movies were so financially radioactive, they didn't just bomb. They annihilated entire studios. Long before Megalopolis started burning through money in 2024, Francis Ford Coppola was already familiar with massive box office bombs. The guy helped define 70s cinema with The Godfather, The Conversation, Apocalypse Now. Absolute classics. But the 80s weren't as kind to him. His first movie of the decade, One from the Heart, was a disaster. It looked gorgeous. Coppola poured a huge chunk of that $27 million budget into pioneering visual techniques and even built a full recreation of Las Vegas on a studio lot. The movie flopped hard, pulling in just $638,000 at the box office. Coppola's own studio, Zoetrope, never recovered. It kept drowning in debt, and in 1992 it filed into bankruptcy for the second time in 3 years. And Coppola spent the next decade making movies just to pay off what he lost on this one. And here's the kicker. A few days ago, Coppola admitted that his next movie is, wait for it, another musical. He says he's going to make it on the cheap because, after Megalopolis, he's out of money. History repeats itself. Back in the 80s, Aurora Productions had a solid start. Their first movie, The Secret of NIMH, made twice its budget. But after that, it was one flop after another. By 1990, they were desperate for a hit. So they bet everything on a $6 million beach volleyball dramedy called Side Out. The people behind this film really believed they were onto something. The director, Peter Israelson, was convinced that volleyball was about to explode in popularity. He even said, when people see this movie, they'll get a sense of a new sport with fantastic athletes in it. The executive producer, Jay Weston, was so sure about this that he spent 6 years developing it. 6 years. He said, surfing was the sport of the 70s, volleyball is the sport of the 90s, and went as far as declaring that the timing of this movie is absolutely perfect. Turns out, they overestimated how much people cared about volleyball. The movie bombed, bringing in just over $400,000. And with that, Aurora Productions went down. The legendary producer Lev Grade once joked that it would have been cheaper to lower the Atlantic than make this movie. And he wasn't wrong. The film was based on Clive Cussler's novel, and ITC Entertainment dumped $40 million into making it. Most of that budget went into a massive scale model of the Titanic that they planned to lift from the ocean floor. But here's the problem. They built the model for $350,000, then realized it was too big for the tank they had. So they spent another $6 million building a bigger tank. And in the end, the whole production cost just $1 million less than building the actual Titanic back in 1912. And sure, the visuals were impressive. But audiences just did not care. The movie made a pathetic $7 million, and ITC had to sell off its distribution arm just to stay afloat. And Clive Cussler hated this movie. He was so furious about how it turned out that he refused to sell the film rights to any of his other Dirk Pitt novels for 20 years. When he finally did, the first one they adapted was Sahara with McConaughey, and surprise, surprise, he hated that one too. People love to call Cleopatra one of the biggest box office bombs of all time. But here's the thing. It actually made its money back. The fall of the Roman Empire, not so much. Samuel Bronston Productions went all in on this one. They built a massive 92,000 square meter Roman Forum, the biggest outdoor set Hollywood had ever seen. The production was record-breaking in every way, including how badly it flopped. The movie only made back about a quarter of its $19 million budget, and just 3 months after its release, Bronston's company went bankrupt. And beyond just losing money, the movie pretty much wiped out the entire Roman epic genre. It took Ridley Scott's Gladiator nearly 40 years later to bring ancient Rome back to the big screen in a way that actually worked. Martin Scorsese is one of the people who actually defends this movie. He called it the poignant beauty of a lost art, saying that this was the last great American epic before Hollywood decided these films were just too expensive to make. The setup here is almost funny. Michael Cimino had just won 5 Oscars for The Deer Hunter, so Hollywood was treating him like a genius. United Artists basically handed him a blank check to make his next film, a Western epic that was supposed to rival Gone with the Wind. The original budget was $11 million, but then Cimino got to work. He rebuilt sets because they didn't look right. He moved entire trees to perfect his shots. He demanded up to 50 takes for the simplest scenes. By the time he was done, he'd shot 220 hours of footage, and the budget had ballooned to $44 million. And the final product was a 3-hour and 39-minute historical drama that audiences hated. Critics destroyed it. The movie made just $3.5 million, United Artists collapsed, and Cimino went from Oscar-winning genius to Hollywood's most hated director almost overnight. The same industry that had worshipped him now saw him as the guy who bankrupted a studio and ended New Hollywood's golden era. He spent the rest of his career trying to recover, but nothing worked. By the 90s, he was stuck directing low-budget flops, and by the time he died in 2016, he'd become a recluse. The Right Stuff is one of those movies that had everything going for it. A great director, an incredible cast, near universal critical acclaim. It won 4 Oscars, got nominated for Best Picture, and even landed on Roger Ebert's list of the greatest movies ever made. And yet, it still lost money. At the time, the Ladd Company was desperate for a hit. They'd had a string of flops, and The Right Stuff was supposed to turn things around. But despite all the praise, it just didn't pull in enough at the box office, falling $6 million short of its $27 million budget. Roger Ebert loved this movie so much, he actually put it right behind The Godfather on his list of great American epics. He called it a film that considers each scene as intently as an art film, and placed it alongside Nashville, Apocalypse Now, and Patton. But here's the difference. The Godfather is still talked about today. The Right Stuff? Not so much. The movie's failure was the final nail in the coffin for the Ladd Company. They briefly survived off the success of Police Academy, but once their deal with Warner Brothers ended, the founders basically shut the whole thing down. Carolco Pictures had some huge hits in the 80s and early 90s. Terminator 2, Total Recall, Basic Instinct. But by the mid-90s, they were in deep financial trouble. And instead of playing it safe, they bet everything on Cutthroat Island, a massive pirate adventure directed by Rennie Harlin and starring Gina Davis. Big mistake. The production was a disaster. Harlin was pushing for everything to be bigger, flashier, more expensive. He even spent $1 million of his own money rewriting the script. Carolco was already drowning in debt, so they couldn't afford it themselves. And then there was the chaos on set. Harlin fired his chief camera operator, and 24 crew members immediately quit in protest. Gina Davis wanted to quit too, but her contract wouldn't let her. By the time the movie hit theaters, audiences wanted nothing to do with it. It didn't even crack the domestic top 10 opening weekend. Final box office total was just $10 million, on a $98 million budget. It tanked so hard that Guinness World Records named it the biggest box office bomb ever. Carolco went bankrupt, and Hollywood refused to touch pirate movies for almost a decade. It took Pirates of the Caribbean in 2003 to finally change that. John Travolta pulled off one of the greatest career comebacks ever with Pulp Fiction in 1994. And then he threw it all away 6 years later with Battlefield Earth. This was his passion project, his big love letter to Scientology, based on the novel by Scientology founder Ron Hubbard. He personally put $5 million of his own money into it, and he was so convinced it would be a hit that he even said, "It's like Star Wars, but better and the Schindler's List of sci-fi movies. This movie was so bad that its original screenwriter, J.D. Shapiro, apologized for it. Years later, he said, looking back at the movie with fresh eyes, "I can't help but be strangely proud of it. Because out of all the sucky movies, mine is the suckiest." Barry Pepper, who starred in it, later said the film failed because of a weak script and poor production values. And Roger Ebert put it on his most hated list, calling it not merely bad, it's unpleasant in a hostile way. Financially, it was a disaster. The movie lost $44 million. The studio behind it, Franchise Pictures, got sued for fraud because they had inflated the budget numbers to trick investors. That lawsuit destroyed the company. Travolta spent years trying to spin the failure, but it didn't matter. This movie became the punchline for terrible sci-fi. In the late 90s, Fox Animation had one big hit, Anastasia. They were hoping to follow it up with Titan A.E., a big, ambitious sci-fi adventure. And right away, things did not go as planned. Before the movie even came out, Fox laid off 2/3 of its animation staff. That's how little faith they had in this project. And they were right. Despite having A-list voice actors like Matt Damon and Drew Barrymore, the movie bombed hard. It pulled in just $36 million, barely half its budget. And 20th Century Fox wasted little time in putting their animation studio out of its misery, cutting the cord just 1 week after the movie's release. When people talk about bad video game movies, they usually mean something like Super Mario Bros. Or Alone in the Dark, movies that completely butcher the source material. The Spirits Within wasn't like that. It actually had some respect for the franchise, and it even made a decent amount of money, pulling in $85 million at the box office. But here's the problem. It cost a ridiculous $137 million to make. Square Pictures had 200 people working on this thing for 4 years, painstakingly trying to create photorealistic CGI characters. The goal was to simulate human emotions and movements through computer graphics. And sure, it looked impressive for the time, but it just wasn't enough to justify that insane budget. The movie lost so much money that it killed Square Pictures. After this, they never got another shot at feature films. Warner Brothers had a massive hit in 1996 with Space Jam. So naturally, Warner thought they could do it again in 2003 with Looney Tunes back in action. It did not go as planned. This time, the Looney Tunes were front and center. No basketball, no Jordan, just straight-up cartoon antics mixed with live action. And apparently, nobody cared. The movie pulled in just $68.5 million against its $80 million budget. Warner Brothers took the loss and decided they were done with Looney Tunes. They scrapped plans for any future shorts and shut down their animation offshoot completely. On paper, The Golden Compass should have been a massive Harry Potter-level success. It had a huge budget, $180 million, the most expensive movie New Line Cinema had ever made. And it actually did pretty well at the box office, pulling in $372 million worldwide. So, what went wrong? Well, in an attempt to finance the movie, New Line made one huge mistake. They sold off the international rights. So even though the movie made hundreds of millions overseas, they didn't see a dime of it. Domestically, the movie only pulled in $70 million, and that wasn't enough to save them. New Line got hit so hard that they had to merge with Warner Brothers just to stay alive. Remember when Nicolas Cage movies actually got theatrical releases instead of going straight to video on demand? Back in 2008, Bangkok Dangerous even managed to hit #1 at the US box office, but with the lowest opening total for a #1 movie in 5 years. Not exactly a great start. And it only got worse from there. The movie dropped like a rock in the charts, barely scraping together $15 million domestically. The international box office helped boost that to $42.5 million, but that still wasn't enough to cover its $45 million budget. It lost money, and the company behind it, Virtual Studios, decided to shut down completely after the flop. The producers just walked away. Gone. If there's one thing Hollywood has not figured out, it's how to make Mars movies work. Red Planet, Mission to Mars, John Carter, The Space Between Us, all of them bombed. But nothing flopped harder than Mars Needs Moms. This thing cost $150 million to make, and it barely made a third of that back. The final worldwide total was $39 million. That made it Disney's biggest financial loss ever at the time. And the damage didn't stop there. Robert Zemeckis had just launched Image Movers Digital, his studio dedicated to performance capture animation, and this was supposed to be a big project for them. Instead, after Mars Needs Moms tanked, Disney pulled the plug on the studio entirely after just 2 movies. This beloved Christmas classic was such a flop that it bankrupted the studio that made it. It sounds impossible now, but when it came out in December 1946, people avoided it. Whatever the reason, it barely managed to break even. Liberty Films, the company behind it, was done. They had no choice but to sell out to Paramount. And here's the ironic part. It took 30 years for the movie to actually become a classic. A clerical error pushed it into the public domain, meaning TV stations could air it for free. And that's how it finally found its audience.